Russian President Vladimir Putin has been in lengthy telephone discussions with his Kazakh counterpart, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. This comes after Russia sent thousands of troops to help put down civil unrest in Kazakhstan. Authorities say they've regained control over the largest city following Tokayev's orders to shoot to kill protesters. Almaty was the central flashpoint during days of violent protest, in which dozens were killed and many more were arrested.
Almaty ablaze, the city scarred from the worst violence to hit Kazakhstan in 30 years. President Tokayev told Kazakh security forces they could shoot to kill, opening the door for a dramatic escalation in the crackdown on protesters.
The counter-terrorist operation continues. The militants have not laid down their arms. They continue to commit crimes or prepare for committing them. The fight against them should be completed. Whoever does not surrender will be eliminated.
The Kremlin has heeded President Tokayev's calls for assistance and sent more than 2,000 troops to help put out the fire on Russia's doorstep. But there are few signs of peace here on the streets of Kazakhstan, as each day brings fresh bloodshed. Almaty, the country's largest city, has become ground zero in a deadly battle against what many here see as a crooked government.
We want to tell the whole world that the only thing flourishing in Kazakhstan is corruption.
At night, when we hear explosions, I'm scared. It hurts to know that young people are dying.
The protests began over a hike in fuel prices, but decades of corruption and inequality have fanned the flames of rebellion across a nation rich in resources. Tokayev's response to the protests has sparked international concern. We want to protect the rule of law everywhere. To that end, we call for no violence and for an end to violence. And obviously that also means that there should be no violence against citizens. In that sense, there's unity in what is being heard from the EU, the German government, from me and many others around the world who are saying, please come back to peaceful progress in the country. But as Tokayev raises the stakes in his fight for political survival, there is worry that peaceful progress has given way to brutal authoritarianism.
The journalist Bruce Panera is a Central Asia specialist. He's following the story for us, and he joins us now from Prague. So tell us first, Russia's role. How is that impacting this situation?
Well, you know, the fact that Russia, who ultimately, of course, is the head of this collective security treaty organization, agreed to send what they're calling peacekeepers to Kazakhstan would certainly seem to be an indication that they're siding with the current president, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. So it gives him an extra support. You know, if there really is, this started out as a support, as a protest, you know, for socioeconomic reasons, but there's something else entirely going on here. And it looks like there's a struggle for some sort of struggle for power, you know, within the government. And with Russia agreeing for the first time ever to deploy CSTO troops to another country, that seems to be a sign of support for the people who are in control of the situation right now.
Yeah, especially given the Soviet, post-Soviet relations there. You mentioned about government power struggle. We hear that Kazakhstan's National Security Committee chief, or former chief, has been detained on suspicion of treason. What more can you tell us about that development?
Yeah, well, you know, obviously the fact that someone like that can be detained and about to be charged with treason is amazing. I mean, this is a two-time prime minister in the country, one of the secretary of state, head of the presidential administration, and just only lately, you know, the head of the security service out there. Longtime Nazarbayev loyalist, the first president of Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev. The fact that he is now under arrest and facing serious charges is an indication that, you know, some of the faction anyway that's been loyal to first President Nazarbayev is in big trouble at the moment.
Yeah, and what do we know about the protesters and their demands now? Where does this leave them?
Well, there still are some protests going on around the country. This started out, again, as I mentioned, as peaceful protests about socioeconomic problems in the country and lack of ability to participate in politics. Some of those are still going on in the country. Unfortunately, this other situation that's been evolving with the violence in the East and the declaration of a red alert for terrorism across the country and everything. The protests that started this whole process seem to be the background to something much more serious within the halls of government.
All right, journalist Bruce Punner bringing us the latest. Thank you so much, and we look forward to talking to you soon.
Reed Standish is a correspondent for Radio Free Europe who's been covering this story. He joins us now from Prague. Reed, any news on how protesters are responding to the president's shoot-to-kill orders?
Well, despite the shoot-to-kill order, protests and clashes are still taking place, although everything has calmed down a bit since reaching a point earlier this week. And I think for a lot of ordinary people right now, it's a very tough situation. The government's launched what it's called an anti-terrorist operation to restore order, which has become increasingly violent. And many people are just unable to leave their homes. They have shortages of food and just limited information about what's happening in their own country. So it's a pretty dire situation for a lot of people at the moment.
As you well know, Reed, Kazakhstan's National Security Committee says its former chief has been detained on suspicion of treason. Can you give us some context?
Right. So the arrest of Kassym-Jomart, it's a very notable major development. Although we're not sure exactly what's behind it, I think it signals a bigger power struggle that's taking place within the government right now. Massimov, until earlier this week, he was the head of the KMD, which is the country's domestic intelligence agency, and was a very influential figure in the country. And was an ally of the former president, Nursultan Nazarbayev, who stepped down in 2019 and had ruled the country for almost 30 years. So while we haven't received a ton of details about what's behind this, apart from him being accused of treason, in the same press release that was put out, it was also said that there are other unidentified security officials who are also detained.
I'm curious about the protesters' demands. The government has already been sacked. What are the protesters now asking for?
Well, there isn't any kind of consolidated opposition that makes some of this different, but people want accountability, they want political representation, and they want an end to, what is endemic corruption across this country. So it's very difficult to imagine any of that being, brought about right now, given the situation in the country and, the government issuing, shoot-to-kill orders and security forces out on the streets.
As we heard, Russia has sent in thousands of troops at President Tokayev's request, but Vladimir Putin's spokesman has previously said there should be no outside interference. What are we to make of this apparent contradiction?
Well, I think that's just very reflective of how the Kremlin views Kazakhstan and its role in there. I also think, given this, news that we're talking about with, Massimov being dismissed, I think that, there's a lot of questions about why Tokayev would want Russian help. And given that if there is, in fact, a power struggle behind the scenes, it could be very useful of him to boost his standing at home to show that he has the Kremlin's backing.
Many, many thanks. That's journalist Reed Standish.
The United Nations, the U.S., and the EU have all called for a peaceful resolution. But years of economic grievance have paved the way toward the unrest we're seeing today.
Almaty is the business hub of Kazakhstan, but lately it's been more like a battle scene. The protests started when fuel prices increased sharply. Demonstrators are angry because despite Kazakhstan's economic success, average people don't feel the wealth trickling down. Kazakhstan has taken advantage of its assets since the collapse of the Soviet Union. It stands at the crossroads of trade routes between China, Russia, and Europe. The 9th largest country in the world also has massive reserves of natural resources. The blessings are plenty for the Central Asian country. It's estimated that Kazakhstan has one of the world's largest oil reserves. It's the leading uranium producer, and there's huge demand from the tech sector for Kazakhstan's rare earths. Kazakhstan is the second largest hub for another form of mining, cryptocurrencies. But that's being disrupted by the government shutdown of the internet. That's not the only disturbance. Turkish Airlines has stopped all flights to the country until at least Sunday, citing the ongoing unrest.
Earlier, I spoke to Ben Ozog, a researcher at the Center for Security Studies focusing on Eurasia. He explained how the protests were triggered by the price hike in liquefied petroleum gas.
The Kazakhstani government had reduced subsidies, which pushed prices up. But such subsidies are an important factor for people who do not have access to posts and riches in the country. And not only did prices rise sharply, people also suspected that corruption was a reason for it, and that the government communicated the change poorly. And this all happened despite the rich hydrocarbon reserves Kazakhstan has. Oil alone makes up around half of its exports. Kazakhstan itself is a middle-income country at around $10,000 of GDP per capita. That is similar to Russia. But inequality is very high, and that feeds into these protests. We're talking about inequalities between cities and the countryside, between regions, and this is inequality in terms of jobs, infrastructure, income, and so on.
So there's a lot of disparity. Yes, but I wanted to ask you, Benno, what kind of economic change do the protesters want to see?
Currently, the protests lack leadership and may be motivated by different grievances in different places of this huge country. So it's hard to identify clear demands. Obviously, a rise in living standards and more equality are part of it. Everyday life for many Kazakhstani is harsh, exacerbated by the pandemic. Minimum wages are low, for example, and the economy is not diversified, innovation is not fostered, it's not modernized. So this reliance on resource rents remains very high. But this wealth is captured by a very small elite. So economic demands are tied to the dissatisfaction with the political leadership. Some of the slogans are "Old man, get out," and this echoes earlier protests in previous years as well. The country is ruled in authoritarian fashion, and this fosters a self-serving political and economic elite and corruption. And there's an entire lack of hope for things to change. And this was the context in which a spark, like this spike in gas prices, ignited a fire. So while some people's economic demands are specific, many are asking for much wider political change as well.
Ben Ozog, he's a senior researcher at the Center for Security Studies focusing on Eurasia. Thank you very much.